Fixing web data in production. I'm going to talk about this. Hopefully I'm going to say something you hadn't thought about already. So a little bit about me. My name is Aaron. I'm a full stack engineer at a company called Voxy. We make a product for teaching people English as a second language. And a few things about the company and what I work on. It's a Django web app. It's about 8 years old. We have 12 engineers. We have several data stores that do various things. Some of them don't work so well with each other. So it's not like an ideal greenfield project. It's also not an enterprise type of thing where we have a full-time DBA in-house who's going to take care of all this stuff for us. So the closer you are to this description, probably the more relevant this is going to be for you. Okay. Oh shit. Something went wrong. Some data got messed up. It was probably me. Okay, so let's just imagine a scenario. We have some feature toggles in our app for enabling and disabling various things for different users. Okay, maybe this is the kind of thing that you've used before. And somebody did something that accidentally set the orientation videos feature toggle to false for everybody. Oh no. So now no one's seeing their orientation videos. And fortunately, you do have a way to recover that information. You have a database backup, a regular snapshot that's been taken once a day that you can go back and find out what people's values were before this mess up. So now we're going to fix that. Okay, open up your SQL console and start typing some SQL and fix it, right? Preferably not. That would probably be your inclination if you are either just like so new that you don't know, you haven't thought about all the things that could go wrong, or if you're just so arrogant that you think that you're so smart, you'll never get this wrong. What I prefer to do is to have a process for fixing these kinds of things. Because some things could happen. You could bring down your site. Maybe the query that you end up running, you don't think about it hard enough, and it takes way longer to execute than you thought it would. Your database screeches to a halt. You could leave out something in your data filtering, and you could end up just getting it wrong. And then maybe you've gotten it so wrong that you don't know what right is anymore. And the reason I'm talking about this is because these are things that have happened to me and to people that I know. Okay, so the solution to this is to never ever change your data. And what that entails is just always getting everything right. Don't introduce any bugs, make all the correct architecture decisions. And if you are in that kind of situation, then bless you, great for you. Hit me up, looking for a job. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce some what I consider best practices for dealing with those kind of situations. So let's talk about some realistic steps that we can take. I think the first, and really I think this is just table stakes. This should be so obvious, which is like, don't just open up your terminal or your ORM shell that has access to your ORM and just start typing stuff. Write it as code and check it into source control so that you have a record of what was done. Write some tests. Now this might feel like it's a waste of time because this is some code that you're going to execute once and then you're going to throw it away. So it might feel like a big waste of time to sit there writing unit tests for this one-time use script. But you're much better off writing a test and wasting 20 minutes or whatever to mock everything correctly than to deal with the fallout of getting it wrong and missing something. And then obviously if you have a code review process, which you should, then get somebody else to look at the script and make sure that you aren't introducing any bugs. Okay, so this should all be Very obvious stuff. Okay, so now let's get into some stuff that I think is a little less obvious, but still should be, pretty common sense, which is you should be tracking what's happening as you run your fixes. So worst case scenario is you kick off a script and there's a cursor there blinking at you. You don't know how long it's going to take. You don't know what it's doing. When it finishes running, you don't know if it did it, right? So what I prefer to do is to just log everything very heavily, starting with, let's just make sure that you've recorded when this thing happened, right? Because a week from now, when you find that there is a problem with the data that you introduced, you want to know like exactly when this happened so you can go back and start investigating and debugging. And then I would say you would want to log everything that changes. So if you have taken your feature toggle, if you've changed the value of a feature toggle in one row in the database, I would like to know what it was before and what it is after. And then I would also want to know what didn't change. And I'll show you an example of some of that. So finally some code, you're saying. Finally, it shows us some code. So this is just a pretend script. It's not a real one. So if there's some syntax errors in there or whatever, just ignore them. But essentially, like, we have a function here that I'm going to run, and I'm going to log at the beginning, when did we start this, and I'm going to log at the end when it's finished, and in the middle, I'm going to log what we did, and then I'm also going to log, right here you can see something that didn't happen, which is this field is already the value that we expect it to, or that we want it to be, so we're going to skip that line. This is all really valuable information to have later, and I'll come back to that in a bit. Another important piece of this is I don't want for this log to just live on my laptop, because I'm not the only person that's working on this application. I'm working with other people, and so this is information that should be readily available to everybody. So the little solution, super simple solution that we've put in place for this is we're using Amazon Kinesis Firehose to write all of the logs from these scripts to Amazon S3. And the reason that we're using this is just because it's just so simple. You don't have to think about much of anything. You go and set up a Firehose in Amazon AWS, and then you can just put a record, and that's just going to add a line to a file. The file buffers for like 10 minutes, and then it writes out to a file on S3, and then you have a full record of everything that's happened. And so, like, notice I have a little script there, or a little function there that I'm not showing you, which is get file name of caller. I'm just going to inspect I'm going to use the inspection to find what the file that called this, so I can know what backfill script we're talking about here. I'm going to log the environment. I'm going to log the timestamp of when this happened, and then the message is whatever I want it to be. So that's really useful for sharing those things. Another important aspect of this is, like, again, I want to know how long is this going to take? Like, how long do I need to wait? Am I 10% done? Am I 50% done, right? And a cool little tool that I use for that is TQDM. Is anybody familiar with this? It's going to give you a progress bar. So if you take an iterable and pass it in as an argument to TQDM, and then pass it a count. The count is optional, but it's useful if you have something, if getting the count, like if you have a list of, or sorry, if you have like something that's going to take a long time to get the count of, you may want to get the count ahead of time in a more efficient way, and then pass that in. But then this TQDM is going to give you a progress bar that'll show you how far along you are and how much more time this is expected to take. It's super useful. Speaking of taking a long time, wouldn't this be annoying? You kick off your script, you let it run for 2.5 hours, and on item 6,000,004, you have an error, and your script stops running, right? And you have to go in and fix it and start it up again. And maybe you don't actually know what has happened and what hasn't happened because you didn't log right because you weren't listening to me very well. And so then you get into the situation where like, what do? I don't know where to start. When I rewrite this and fix the error, I don't know where to start from. So think about the possible exceptions that you might get ahead of time, like I don't know if anybody ever encounters this sort of thing, but this happens to me from time to time. I expect something to be there that's not there, and then I call a method on it. So you want to do things like this. You want to try and accept in cases where something that you expect to exist might not actually exist. And of course, you want to log it so you know that that was skipped, and you can come back and kind of like manually debug, well, why wasn't there a feature toggle for this particular user? So there's this fancy word that I like to use called idempotent. I don't know if I pronounced it right, but this is basically the idea that if you write your script, you run it for 2 hours, and it fails, you want to be able to run it again and still get the desired result, right? You don't want something that you expected to happen once to happen twice, to happen again when you rerun it. And this takes a little bit of thought to execute well. And this is not something I suggest that you would always do, but I have had cases where I found this useful if I want to run a script for something that's in a database model. I might add a field that's just a backfilled field, and just like a temporary field that I add to that model. And then I run my script, and when I've finished backfilling that line, that item, I'm just going to mark it as backfilled. And that way, if I need to rerun this script, I'm already filtering by backfilled equals false. And so you can feel safe that you can start and stop this script as many times as you want and always get the desired result. And then you drop that field when you're done. Again, this is not always a good idea, but it's a technique that might be useful if you're dealing with a lot of data or something. Related to that is going back to the logging. If you've logged well, like in this example, I've backfilled units, okay? So you have something called a unit, and it has a property called it has a field called resource ID, and I'm just logging what it was before and then what it is after the script ran. And if I have all these logs and they contain the information about what it was before and what it is after, then it's a little bit of work, but I could use these logs, parse these logs to reverse what I've done, right? I could go back and find all these units and change 5.4 CA7 whatever back to none. By parsing these logs. So that's one of the reasons that I think it's useful and important to have serious logging for the execution of these kind of scripts. All right, so what if you're dealing with an actual large amount of data? All right, so if you've got a few thousand lines of data that need to be fixed, then okay, that's fairly simple to deal with. But if you have an actual large amount of data, or you have something that's like very computationally expensive or whatever, then you might need to think about the possible bottlenecks that you'll encounter when executing these fixes. So maybe it's CPU. In that case, what would you do? Maybe try to parallelize the script's execution on a couple of machines or something like that. For my usages, like CPUs are usually not a bottleneck. We just don't have a lot of like fancy stuff happening. Memory might be an issue if you, let's say you want to grab 10 million rows out of the database and then put them all into a list. If you don't have a lot of memory available, then that might become a problem, so don't do that. In a lot of cases, in my experience, the database is going to be a big bottleneck, especially if you are doing the really naive approach of grabbing a list of items from the database and then looping over them and doing things one row at a time. So in that case, you might want to use the features of your ORM. So for example, here's something that's available in the Django ORM. There's a bulk create function that allows you to create several items. Actually, this is an example of where the code is actually not correct at all. Because I'm just, what I would want to do is bulk create at the, I don't want to bulk create once for each item. I want to bulk create at the end. So I would want to create the feature toggles in a list and then, or instantiate them, put them into a list, and then bulk create them all at once. But the idea is that you would want to use your ORM for doing this so that you're making one big SQL query instead of a million small ones. And then there's times when you really might need to drop down to, directly to SQL or whatever database language you're using, if you're on MongoDB or whatever. Sometimes it can save you a ton of time to drop down to that level. So here's an example of a script that's going to, create a connection and then execute an actual SQL query, and then do something with the results of that. And I've found in certain cases, like something that was going to take me days to do using the ORM is going to take like an hour to do by executing SQL queries explicitly. But in a lot of cases, the biggest overhead is going to be just like keeping it all in your head and making sure that you're not, that the changes that you're making to your data are what you expect they should be. Does that make sense? So my simple rule of thumb is I like to use the ORM when I can, and I like to drop down to that lower level of SQL when it becomes necessary. And I don't know, I've had debates with coworkers who will take a look at a pull request of a script that I've written and say, hey, this would be more efficient if you did it this way. And meanwhile, the scale of data is like a script that's going to run in 10 minutes. So like, why would you spend time making something that's going to run in 10 minutes, run in 4 minutes? In a lot of cases, you just want to stay at the level that you're most comfortable, use existing functions, use existing models in your web application and so on. Okay, so now I'm going to get back to something else that I consider to be fairly obvious, but depending on the architecture of your applications, may be a little more challenging, which is making sure to use data snapshots correctly. So one thing you probably want to do, if it's at all possible, is if you have a script and you are in the least bit doubting what's going to happen when you run it, it would be a great idea to make a snapshot of your production data and run your script against that, that backup. And then you can see exactly what's going to happen, and you can see that you're going to get that, that error on line 6,000,004 before you run it in production. It's also a great idea to take a database snapshot right at the moment that you're going to execute your scripts, so that you have a very clear before and after. And if you can automate that, so much the better, right? If you can build something into your script execution practices that is going to allow you to just kick off a snapshot of your database, then that would be great. Then you don't have to remember to do that, or you don't have to tell your coworkers to remember to do that. So that's pretty much what I have to say about this topic. I'm remarkably running very short on time. I'm sorry, I'm finished very early is what I meant to say. So I'm happy to take 20, 30 questions. Yes.
Would you still write a script if you just had like a few records to update? And then also, like, would you ever consider, instead of like updating all the records, updating something about your source code to be able to handle different data instead?
Okay, so the question was, two questions. One is, would you still go through this process if you're just fixing a couple of records? And like you just have to make a good decision, like a judgment call, right? What is a few? Is it 10? If it's 3, go ahead and like fix it yourself, because you can see what those 3 records were before and what they were after, and if you mess it up, let's say 3. I don't know. It depends what those 3 records are. Also, if it's 3 out of 4 million users and you're changing their email address or something like that, sure, do it live. And then the other question was, what about the case of essentially like doing this in code in the regular like execution of your application, rather than having this be a separate script that you would run? And that's like a really great question. And this is something that I've had some experience with, which is, I consider that essentially like what's the term that I would use for it? Like kind of like a live backfilled, right? So it's essentially you're going to, let's say you have a user and you know the correct value of this property for the user, or what this property needs to be set. Whenever you save that user again, you're going to set this value to what it should be, right? And that's a really great technique, and it's often necessary to do if you need to, let's say if you need to fix some data, both like historical data, which you would do in a script, and then also like new incoming data. Like if you need to make sure that like your data is consistent, and you're making a change, sometimes it's necessary to do both, right? So for new incoming stuff, you're going to have some function that will fix the incoming data, and then you separately would have a script that's running that's going to clean up all the edge cases for all the users who you aren't saving because they're not that active, or for all the whatever that you're fixing that isn't getting saved again or isn't being touched again. Yes, sir.
Have you run into situations where you have, let's say, a giant chunk of data that you need to update, so you need to write a SQL statement?
Yeah.
But it ends up blocking your database, so you're not really able to run that on live data.
Yeah. So I'm sure you can all hear. He's in the middle. But yes. So sometimes two of the things that I talked about, which is being able to track the execution of the script, and then running the script like quickly when you have a large amount that needs to be fixed, can be in opposition to each other and sometimes, right? Often if you're making a SQL query, you can do something in a SQL query that will execute much more quickly than looping through individual items, but it's just going to lock and you won't know when it's going to be done. It's not going to, I've run into situations like that. What I found is useful in those kind of cases is to just batch up, like essentially like run in batches. So instead of like running a SQL query that's going to take all of the data in a table and change a value, do 1,000,000 rows at a time or something like that. Using limits and offsets and so on. Yes, sir.
Any integration with trouble ticketing in this process that you go through?
Triple ticketing?
Trouble ticketing, like when you say you log the process, presumably there's been a ticket created of we screwed with all the videos.
Uh-huh.
Is that where you keep the logs, or?
I don't know what Tribble is specifically. Trouble. Oh, okay. So, okay, got it. So, yeah, like a bug tracking system or something.
Whatever you might use, font bugs or?
Yeah, I haven't found a necessity. That isn't where I would keep the logs, but
That's kind of the question, is like where do the logs go and how do you connect those to the initial problem?
yeah, I mean, just a super simple answer to that would be, here in your logging, if one of the items that you wanted to drop in there was the ID of a bug ticket, then there you go. I mean, that's not super integrated or anything. I'm sure there's better ways of doing that if your use case requires it.
No, I just think that you had quite a good process that you went through. I wondered if there was any integration with other in-house processes.
Yeah. All right, thank you, everybody.